The blade went through Ragnar's back on a cold winter morning. When he turned around, gasping for breath, he saw his own son holding the weapon. "Why?" Ragnar whispered. The answer would destroy everything the Lothbrok family had built for generations. This isn't just another story of Viking warfare. This is the most devastating family betrayal in history, one that didn't just kill a king, but murdered an entire dynasty. Ragnar Lothbrok had everything a Viking king could want: vast territories, legendary reputation, divine favor, and most importantly, 5 sons to carry on his legacy: Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Ubba, Vitsirk, and Sigurd Snake in the Eye. These weren't just any children, they were princes trained from birth to be kings, warriors, and leaders. Ragnar had spent decades building an empire that would span generations, with each son destined to rule different kingdoms across the North Sea. But blood doesn't guarantee loyalty. And sometimes, the greatest enemies come from within your own family. Because what happened next wasn't just betrayal, it was systematic family annihilation. One son's jealousy and ambition would turn brother against brother, destroy Ragnar's empire from within, and end the Age of Vikings forever. The son who did it? He planned it for years, smiled while doing it, and felt no remorse as everything burned. Vikings! If you want to discover the most devastating family betrayal in history, strike that red shield. Join our clan and witness how blood family became blood enemies. The favorite son. Problem: Ragnar's fatal mistake was having favorites among his sons. While he publicly claimed to love them all equally, privately everyone knew the truth. Ivar the Boneless was his strategic heir, Bjorn Ironside was his warrior pride, and Ubbi was his diplomatic hope. But what about Vitsirk and Sigurd? They watched from the shadows as their father lavished attention, resources, and training on their brothers. The seeds of resentment grew with every passing year. Sigurd Snake in the Eye, in particular, felt forgotten. Named for the serpent mark in his eye that his father found disturbing, Sigurd grew up believing he was the unwanted son, the mistake, the burden. The incident that changed everything. The breaking point came during Ragnar's return from his English campaigns. A great feast was held to celebrate his victory, and Ragnar called each son forward to receive gifts and praise. Ivar received new strategic advisors and maps of future conquests. Bjorn got legendary weapons and promises of leading the next raid. Ubbi was granted diplomatic missions and territorial control. When Sigurd stepped forward, Ragnar barely looked at him. "Sigurd," he said dismissively, "you can help your mother with the household management." The hall fell silent. A prince had just been assigned women's work in front of the entire court. The humiliation was complete and public, from hurt to hatred. That night, Sigurd made a decision that would destroy everything. If his father wouldn't give him respect through love, he would take it through fear. He began studying his father's weaknesses, learning his routines, identifying his vulnerabilities. But more dangerously, he started poisoning his brothers against each other and against Ragnar. Sigurd whispered to Vitsirk about how Ragnar favored the others. He suggested to Ivar that Bjorn was trying to undermine his strategic plans. He convinced Ubbi that Ragnar was setting them all up to fail. Building the betrayal. Sigurd's greatest achievement was recruiting Vitsirk to his cause. Vitsirk, also feeling overlooked and undervalued, became Sigurd's partner in planning their father's downfall. Together, they began sabotaging Ragnar's operations from within. Failed raids that should have succeeded, missing supplies that caused strategic defeats, intelligence leaks that warned enemies of Ragnar's plans. Ragnar noticed the failures but never suspected his own sons. He blamed incompetent advisors, bad luck, or enemy spies. The possibility that his own blood was working against him never crossed his mind. The point of no return. The final plan was simple but devastating. Frame their brothers for treason while eliminating Ragnar permanently. Sigurd would kill their father and blame it on external enemies, then use the chaos to seize power. But the plan required perfect timing and absolute commitment. There could be no hesitation, no mercy, no family sentiment. On that cold winter morning, as Ragnar reviewed battle plans alone in his chamber, Sigurd made his choice. Family meant nothing. Power meant everything. The perfect moment. Ragnar stood alone in his private chamber, studying maps of his next English campaign. Snow fell outside the windows, and the fire crackled peacefully. He was completely relaxed, surrounded by the warmth and security of his own home. This was the moment Sigurd had been waiting for. His father vulnerable, alone, and completely trusting. Ragnar heard footsteps behind him, but didn't turn around. He assumed it was one of his advisors or servants. "Father," Sigurd said softly. Ragnar smiled without looking up, still focused on his maps. He was genuinely happy to spend time with any of his sons. The blade goes in. Sigurd drew his father's own ceremonial dagger, the one Ragnar had received from Odin himself. The irony was intentional. Ragnar would die by his own sacred weapon, wielded by his own sacred blood. The blade slid between Ragnar's ribs with surgical precision. Sigurd had studied anatomy, had practiced this exact motion hundreds of times. He knew exactly where to strike for maximum damage with minimum immediate death. Ragnar gasped, his hands flying to his back, feeling the warm blood spreading across his tunic. The map scattered as he stumbled forward, catching himself against the table. "Why?" Ragnar turned around slowly, his face pale with shock and blood loss. When he saw Sigurd holding the bloody dagger, his expression shifted through disbelief, confusion, and finally, devastating heartbreak. "Sigurd," Ragnar whispered, his voice breaking. "My son, why?" Sigurd's response was cold, calculated, and final. "Because you never saw me as your son. You saw me as your mistake. Now you'll die knowing that your biggest mistake was the one who killed you." The poisoned words. As Ragnar sank to his knees, bleeding and dying, Sigurd continued his verbal assault. Years of resentment poured out in a torrent of accusation and rage. "You gave Ivar your respect, Bjorn your pride, Ubi your trust. What did you give me? Household management duties like a servant girl. You made me a joke in front of the entire court." Ragnar tried to speak, to explain, to apologize, but Sigurd wasn't finished. "I spent years planning this moment. Every failure you've experienced in the last 2 years, that was me. Every leaked strategy, every sabotaged raid, every mysterious defeat, your forgotten son destroying your legacy piece by piece. A king dies, a dynasty ends." Ragnar's final words were not curses or threats, but a broken father's plea. "The brothers, don't hurt your brothers. They're innocent in this." Sigurd's response chilled the blood. "They're next, one by one, until only I remain to rule the empire you built." As Ragnar collapsed, dying on the floor of his own chamber, Sigurd stood over him without a trace of remorse. He had murdered his father, but in his mind, he had simply removed an obstacle to his rightful throne. The age of Ragnar was over. The age of blood had begun. Vikings! Can you believe a son could be this cold to his own father? Tell us in the comments, what's the worst family betrayal you've ever heard of? Share this devastating story with those who need to understand the price of family loyalty. The brother war begins. Sigurd's plan to frame external enemies failed immediately. Ivar the Boneless, despite his physical limitations, possessed a strategic mind that rivaled his father's. He analyzed the assassination scene and quickly realized the truth. This was an inside job. When Ivar confronted Sigurd directly, the facade crumbled. But instead of confessing and seeking forgiveness, Sigurd doubled down on his betrayal. "Father is dead," Sigurd declared to his brothers. "The weak leadership ends now. I'm claiming the throne, and anyone who opposes me is an enemy of the family." The Lothbrok sons faced an impossible choice: submit to their father's killer or fight their own brother. Blood against blood. What followed was the most devastating civil war in Viking history. Bjorn Ironside and Ubi refused to accept Sigurd's rule, viewing him as both a kinslayer and a usurper. Ivar, despite his strategic brilliance, found himself caught between justice and family loyalty. Hvitserk, Sigurd's co-conspirator, revealed his role in the betrayal, splitting the family even further. Now it wasn't just about Ragnar's murder. It was about years of sabotage and deception. The empire that Ragnar had spent decades building became the battlefield where his sons would destroy each other. External enemies. Circle. While the Lothbrok sons fought each other, external enemies saw opportunity. King Aella of Northumbria, previously terrified of Ragnar's power, now invaded Viking territories with impunity. Saxon kingdoms that had paid tribute for years stopped their payments. Irish kings who had submitted to Viking rule declared independence. Even allied Viking jarls began questioning their loyalty to a family that couldn't maintain internal peace. The empire's collapse was swift and total. Within 6 months of Ragnar's death, half of his territorial gains were lost to external enemies capitalizing on internal chaos. When trade dies, the Brother War destroyed more than territory. It annihilated the economic foundation of Ragnar's empire. Trade routes that depended on stable leadership became too dangerous to maintain. Merchant vessels that once flew Lothbrok banners were attacked by rival brothers' forces. Tribute that had funded massive military operations dried up as subject territories fell into chaos. Most devastatingly, the legendary Great Heathen Army began to fragment as different commanders chose different brothers to follow. The unified military force that had conquered England dissolved into competing factions. The last stand, the Brother War, reached its climax in a final battle that would determine the fate of the Lothbrok legacy. Sigurd, commanding forces loyal to his claim, faced a coalition of his surviving brothers who had finally united against him. The battle was brutal, personal, and decisive. When the dust settled, Sigurd lay dead on the battlefield, killed not by enemy forces, but by Ivar's own tactical brilliance. But victory came at a price too high to bear. The Lothbrok family was shattered beyond repair, their empire reduced to scattered territories, their legend tainted by fratricide and betrayal. The surviving sons. In the aftermath of the Brother War, only 3 sons remained, Ivar, Bjorn, and Ubbi. But they were no longer brothers in any meaningful sense. Trust had been murdered along with their father, and suspicion poisoned every interaction. Each surviving son took separate territories and ruled independently, refusing to cooperate or coordinate. The unified Lothbrok Empire was permanently fractured into competing kingdoms. Hvitserk, consumed by guilt over his role in the betrayal, disappeared entirely from historical records. Some say he became a hermit, others that he died by suicide, unable to live with what he had helped destroy. The end of an era. Historians mark Ragnar's assassination as the beginning of the end for the Viking Age. The unified leadership that had made Viking expansion possible died with him. Without the Lothbrok dynasty to provide coordinated strategy and massive military resources, Viking raids became smaller, less effective, and increasingly defensive rather than expansive. The Great Heathen Army, once the terror of Europe, never reformed as a unified force. Individual commanders led scattered raids, but the days of massive coordinated invasions were over. The poison spreads. Perhaps most tragically, the Lothbrok family betrayal set a precedent that infected Viking culture for generations. Family loyalty, once the bedrock of Viking society, became suspect. Sons began viewing fathers as obstacles rather than mentors. Brothers saw each other as competition rather than allies. The bonds that had made Viking society strong dissolved into paranoia and ambition. Within 2 generations, most major Viking ruling families had experienced similar internal conflicts, further accelerating the decline of Viking political power. Timeless tragedy. The destruction of the Lothbrok family offers timeless lessons about the dangers of favoritism, the poison of resentment, and the devastating consequences when family trust is violated. Modern business dynasties, political families, and even entertainment empires have followed similar patterns. Successful patriarchs, competing heirs, internal betrayal, and total collapse. The psychological dynamics that destroyed Ragnar's empire continue to destroy families today. Favoritism breeding resentment, ambition overcoming loyalty, and the tragic irony that those we trust most have the power to hurt us most. The truth in the ground. Recent archaeological discoveries have validated much of this tragic story. Excavations in Scandinavia have revealed evidence of rapid territorial abandonment, suggesting sudden political collapse rather than gradual decline. Most tellingly, several sites show evidence of destruction from internal conflict rather than external invasion, indicating that Viking territories were being destroyed by Vikings themselves. The physical evidence supports the saga accounts. The Lothbrok Empire didn't fall to external enemies, but collapsed from within through family betrayal and civil war. The ultimate tragedy. The ultimate tragedy of Ragnar's story isn't that he died. All great leaders eventually die. The tragedy is that his death accomplished nothing positive for anyone involved. Sigurd gained no lasting power from his betrayal. The brothers gained no peace from their civil war. The empire gained no strength from the internal conflict. Everyone lost everything. And for what? Wounded pride and jealous ambition. What we learn. Ragnar's story teaches us that families are not automatically strong. They require constant attention, fairness, and genuine love to remain united. Favoritism, even unconscious favoritism, can plant seeds of destruction that grow over decades. The bonds of blood are powerful, but they are not unbreakable. When trust is violated and resentment is allowed to fester, even the strongest families can destroy themselves from within. Sometimes the greatest enemies are not the ones outside the gates, but the ones sitting at your own table. If this story of family destruction has moved you, honor your own family bonds. Subscribe to explore more lessons from history's greatest rises and falls. And remember, our next journey will reveal how other great dynasties learned from the Lothbrok tragedy or repeated it. The Lothbrok dynasty proved that sometimes the greatest victories can be undone by the smallest resentments. Ragnar conquered kingdoms, but couldn't conquer the jealousy in his own son's heart. In the end, the most devastating weapon against a great leader isn't an enemy army. It's a family member who feels unloved. The Age of Vikings didn't end with external conquest. It ended when sons stopped honoring fathers and blood turned against blood.